Welcome, Jim. It's so great to see you. Thank you for joining me. You are the author of Unequal Justice. I love your background there. It looks
Oh,
fantastic.
thank you. Thank you.
So, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, the book was really a product of 35 years of legal experience. I was a prosecutor. I started out as a prosecutor, and then I became a defense attorney. And all the things that happened in between really was the book kind of wrote itself, to be honest. I mean, I think the people and the lives affected and the cases really were stories in and of themselves that needed to be told. And really, you know, the memory of some of these people needed to be carried out. And, I felt there was a bit of a mission involved in that.
Well, I think that's great. Everyone has a story. Well, you being an attorney and you are in the courtroom, there's always drama and comedy. It seems like there's always something going on, always behind the scenes. And I do a lot of stuff in the film industry. I work with a lot of producers, directors, screenwriters, and there are a lot of portrayals of the courtroom on TV. Would you say that's very similar to what happens in real life, or would you say it's a total fabrication that's been amplified for entertainment?
Yeah, that's a tough one to say. And if I often kid, if I hadn't been a lawyer, I would have been an actor. So there's a lot of parallels and similarities, but it depends on what specifically. There's so many depictions of attorneys and courtroom scenes and in various forms of entertainment. So it's hard to say and pinpoint, yeah, that's accurate or it's not in some situations, there's some recollections I have of movies over the years that I've watched where I say, yeah, that's pretty accurate. And then I've had other, experiences where I've looked at it and said, that's really not how it goes down. That doesn't happen like that. The judge would never rule that way, or, you don't get a chance to direct examination and ask questions of a witness like that, or this attorney's grandstanding. A judge would never allow that to happen. So there's a lot of different things that happen. But yeah, I look at it for entertainment value. I try not to be overly critical when I watch those shows because you tend to like go back to your experience and your background and your training and you say, no, that's not really what happened. So I try not to look at it for that purpose. I look at it for entertainment like anyone else.
Also, when you are working with a client and say you do have to go to trial, do you, what is that process like for you? Is it anything like you see in movies, or is it completely different?
Well, in some situations, I think it's similar. I mean, it's a long process to get to trial. It's not like, somebody gets arrested and they get incarcerated and they get to go to court the next day and have a trial, and that's the thing about movies. It's all condensed, and lately I noticed they do put a timeline. They'll say 7 months later or 8 months later. And that's more accurate, really, because the system takes a while to evolve for people to really get their day in court and have the opportunity to have a jury hear, both sides of the case, really, from the prosecution and from the defense. So it does take a while, and it's a process. And I think by the point in time you get there, you've established a relationship with that client, and there's a level of trust, and belief in your confidence in your abilities. So I think it's like a partnership almost. And that's how I viewed it, quite frankly. I wasn't ever at it myself. I mean, your life is on the line. You're the client. I'm protecting your interest. I'm going to fight like hell for that. And I'm going to explain everything each step of the way so that you understand and you have a clear understanding of it, so that there's nothing that's a mystery, and there never should be. And I think that's the role of a good defense attorney, quite frankly, or even a prosecutor, is to educate, as the process develops and as the case develops, and as you get closer to trial, ultimately pick a jury, and you're in the trial process. And I actually teach a class right now at law school, Seton Hall Law School, as an adjunct professor, and I teach a class called Persuasion and Advocacy. And really, it's nothing more than the anatomy of a trial. Really, what is a trial all about? It's an opening statement. It's, direct examination of witnesses where you can't ask leading type questions. There's cross-examination where you can ask leading questions, which suggests the answer, and it's simply yes and no. And then, of course, there's summation, But before that, there's the introduction of exhibits or documents into evidence, how to do that. So it's really an instructive class. And ultimately, the summation, how powerful that is, that closing argument that you make to a jury, the opportunity to speak to them and convince them that your case is more compelling. So, and I tell my students, I say, it's not so much about a trial. It doesn't matter if you never set foot in a courtroom. The class is persuasion and advocacy, which is really life. you know,
Exactly.
Having the ability to communicate with people and persuade them. Not everybody is in agreement on things, especially today in the political arena.
Exactly.
People are on different sides and it's very divided, but you have to hear people out. Why do they feel the way they feel? Is their feelings, are their positions or their opinions justified? Is it with a background and knowledge? And you may not agree with them, but it doesn't mean you have to dislike that person.
How did you come up with the title Unequal Justice?
Well, and it's an interesting, it was actually my concept, the idea of Lady Justice,
Right.
holding the scales of justice, which we all know what that is. It's common that people understand that. But as you can see, she's peeking out from under the blindfold. That was always my view, is that the Lady Justice was peeking out from the blindfold, and the scales of justice were clearly not in balance. They were not equal. They were not level. So that was my idea, really. And that was the cover of the book. And Unequal Justice really was the product of me kind of moving from being a prosecutor to a defense attorney and seeing that the same system that I operated under as a prosecutor was very different as a defense attorney. And the same rules that applied as a prosecutor were a little bit different when I was a defense attorney, simply by moving from one side of the courtroom to the other side of the courtroom. So that kind of wrote itself. Unequal Justice really was about, I think, my client's constitutional rights being compromised as being accused of a crime, and the idea, the notion, the belief, and the constitutional principle of innocent until proven guilty. I did not find that to be the case as time went on, and the more I was involved in doing defense cases and high profile defense cases, I felt my clients were guilty until they were proven innocent. When we walked into the courtroom, the deck was really stacked against us.
Right. Well, it seems like that happens in life. When people form these opinions, they automatically form judgments. So something like that, when you have a high profile case and you go to trial, it's like if you already have a public opinion against somebody, how do you navigate that?
It's hard. It's very difficult. In fact, I think one of the cases I talk about in the book, I represented a Catholic priest, and obviously we're all aware of the sexual misconduct that happens in the clergy, and it's been very publicized, and it was really national attention was drawn to it. So much so that the church had to become involved and have some oversight and supervision of this, and really come down hard on this. So I had a priest that I represented accused of a sexual abuse of a younger woman. She was a minor under
Mhm.
the law. I felt very much that the deck was stacked against us as we walked into the courtroom. And in fact, in my opening statement at the time, the movie Spotlight had come out, and I think Mark Ruffalo played the attorney in the case. Um, and I don't think I had even seen the movie. I think I saw a trailer to it, and I said to the jury, look, you have got to leave your biases and your prejudices outside the courtroom. This is not the place. And you took an oath as a juror that you could fairly and impartially hear this case and listen to the evidence and evaluate it. And I'm asking you to do that. And I know some of you may have watched this movie and just seen it because it was just out at the time. I forget what year that was. And I said, you know what? That's not the case here. You've got to be objective and listen with an open mind, and not come to a predetermination based upon the fact that you saw a movie and this was happening in that movie and these priests were guilty of committing these offenses. That's not the case here. You have to be a blank slate as you walk in this courtroom. And I was very, very much committed to that, and making sure that that resonated. And I literally walked from one juror to the next juror to the next juror. And we had, it's a jury of 12, but we have two alternates. So it was 14 people sitting in the jury box. And I made sure that I went through and I looked at each one of them in their eyes and spoke to them and spoke to them from my heart. and said, look, this isn't important. This is a person's life on the line here.
Right. But it seems like those type of cases, the he said, she said, are the most difficult to prove when you don't actually have physical proof, right?
They are. They are.
So can I ask, how did that case turn out?
Well, that case, it's interesting. There's a lot of backstory to the case, obviously, that happens. And in this particular case, the head prosecutor that was prosecuting sex crimes at the time had called the diocesan attorney. That's the attorney that represents the church in that diocese, it was Patterson Diocese. And he had called him and said, look, we're going to over indict him. We're going to charge him with this offense. And one of the charges was luring, 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 which is,
Mhm.
my thought of that would be someone pulling up in a car trying to entice a child to get into a car so that
Mhm.
they could abduct them and sexually assault them. And I didn't think of it in the concept of this case, um, because what had happened was the priest would meet this young lady in the church and they would ultimately go over to the rectory, which was just a short walk, maybe just a courtyard away. And the interesting thing was he said to the diocesan attorney that he believed that luring would force him to plead guilty because it was a higher degree offense. It was a much more, and it carried mandatory state prison. It carried all the implications of a sex crime, Megan's law registration requirements, and all those things that go along with sex crimes. And the diocesan attorney, to his credit, said, you don't have the basis to do that. That's not proper. That's not the job of a prosecutor to over indict, to force somebody to plead guilty. And I learned of that. And I actually called the diocesan attorney to testify in the case.
Mhm.
And he indicated, he revealed exactly that communication that he had had. And it was actually memorialized in an email. And he had given me the email communication. So, interestingly, the jury did convict of that very charge, luring. Everything else he was found not guilty of.
Wow.
So, and I think it was a 7-count indictment, which involved endangering the welfare of a minor and aggravated sexual conduct, a couple of other different charges that I can't recall off the top of my head right now.
Did the term grooming come up? Because that seems to be a hot topic now
And
today.
yeah, in other cases that I handled, yes, that definitely was a topic, certainly something that was discussed in testimony and certainly presented in evidence, but not in this particular case. It was never brought up by the prosecutor nor by me, of course, in the defense.
Mhm.
And I don't think that the facts warranted that. It was a young woman who had befriended this priest, and they would talk at night on the phone, and it developed like a friendship. And he was a younger priest, and she was about 15 years of age, I think,
Mhm.
and clearly inappropriate relationship, no matter what.
Right.
I'm not saying condoning the behavior. He was about 32 at the time, so
It, it must be really challenging to both prosecute and defend somebody because there's so many variables that you'll never know the whole story, which I
right.
think is always so fascinating. Neither side will ever truly know the entire story. So when you go into it and you have to either prosecute or defend, you have to really stick to your guns with what you're doing, right? Or
Yeah, well, there's a commitment to the case, obviously, and from the defense perspective, it's very different than being a prosecutor because as a prosecutor, you're representative of the people, the taxpayers, the state, the county, whatever it may be, and your interest is as a prosecutor, under my view, and it should be the view of every prosecutor, is to seek justice. And sometimes justice means not going forward in a case. Now, as a defense attorney, it's very different. I mean, I have someone's life in my hands that I'm representing, and they're coming to me to basically save them, or to find a way to get them out of this process in some way, whether it's pleading guilty to a lesser charge, or negotiating a favorable plea resolution, or going to trial if they're committed to being not guilty, and or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and trying to show that and demonstrate that, which is really not the burden of a defense attorney. The burden of the defense attorney is not to have any burden of proof. It's all upon the prosecution, the state, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the elements of the offense that are charged.
how would you define justice?
Wow, that's a great question. Justice, it's a fleeting term, I would say, because it means different things to different people. Certainly, if um, your family member were the victim of a homicide and they were killed and murdered, I don't think there's any definition of justice that would bring your loved one back. There clearly is not, and I don't think that you would look to our court system to define justice and give you justice. I don't think it ever really happens in those situations. That's a lifelong, life changing event. And, unfortunately, I had to deal with that from time to time. And, that's very difficult. So justice means something very different. For someone else, it might mean in a financial crime being compensated, being paid back what was taken from them unlawfully. A large sum of money, perhaps, that this person had taken from them. Maybe they feel vindicated if they got that money back. So it means different things in different situations. I don't know that it's a, a standard definition. I think it changes.
I would agree. It seems like that with the law itself, it seems to apply to whatever the situation is. And in some cases, depends on who the person is. Are you high profile? Are you just someone off the street? Are you wealthy? Are you poor? It really seems to fluctuate and it seems like that's not necessarily fair.
Yeah, yeah, we've witnessed a lot of that, and I think it becomes a bit of a partisan political issue if we looked at what had happened over these last several years in terms of um, the Department of Justice, the weaponization. I don't want to use that as a talking term, but
Mhm.
it really did happen, and I don't think that these were justified cases, and I don't want to name parties or
Of course.
political views on things, but I did feel that that was an abuse of the process, clearly. And it does, you're right. If it's a higher profile crime that's being accused, the person's being accused of, it gets obviously a lot more attention normally and naturally. If the person has the financial ability, um, whether or not the prosecutor goes after them more aggressively, or the fact that they have a defense team um, at the ready for them, a la OJ. You look at that defense team they put together, the dream team, they called them. Those were some of the highest priced defense attorneys and very qualified, competent people, that were in his corner. So a lot of people looked at that case and said, well, the prosecutor's office, Marsha Clark and Christopher Darden were clearly out of their element. They didn't have the ability. I don't know that that was the case, but clearly there were mistakes made, which resulted in the outcome of that case.
Well, mistakes happen. We are human, no matter how intelligent you are. But I have to ask, the RFK, I'm sorry, the JFK files, President Kennedy, has been released, and now has come out that the CIA was involved with his murder. And this might be too controversial, and we can cut it out if you don't like it. But I have to ask you because you've been in the field for so long. Was something like that where the CIA is behind the assassination of an American president? How does that have a ripple effect in this country, especially in the field of law? Because if you have this top-notch agency that's supposed to be funded by the taxpayers do something like that, how can we trust the government?
So that's a great question. I think it creates an inherent distrust of government. Um, and, I guess we all, as citizens, had our own opinions until, we see the evidence. And, there were so many things happening at that time, targeting, organized crime and appointing Bobby Kennedy as the U.S. attorney to oversee the prosecution. I mean, you really, if you study history and you know history, and I don't profess to be a historian on this issue at all, but I certainly know enough about it because it was something that was fascinating to me. The whole Sam Giancana, getting the vote out in Chicago to help him win the state of Illinois, and whether there was payback to be made from the mob bosses because he betrayed them, and you know. Frank Sinatra being involved, that he didn't go to his house. Um, Palm Springs versus going to Bing Crosby's house. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, if you know, you know. That's the kind of thing. And you can certainly draw strings and connections. But I think that your basic question is that there's a certain level of distrust from taxpayers, and maybe it was in the back of people's minds that maybe the government was involved, to take down this president. And it's not so hard to believe as we look at events today. What are going on today is not so different than what happened in the 60s. So um,
Mhm.
it's a long time overdue. Quite frankly, these reports probably should have been released years ago while some of these people were still alive. In fact, I think the last CIA agent that actually jumped on top of John F. Kennedy and protected him from further bullets being fired just died just a couple of weeks ago, and I think he was one of the last few people remaining from that event. So it was far too long to release that. Waiting 60 years. I mean, really, there was no need. But I think the reason why was because the CIA was concerned about the optics, you know,
Do
and
you
and
do you
that,
think
that was clear under the last administration because Mike Pompeo was the head of the CIA at one time and he was part of Trump's cabinet, and he blocked the release. He basically convinced Donald Trump not to release those JFK reports, and there's a reason why.
well, do you think this will change anything with this kind of information now released? Will anything change? Do people actually care?
Well, I think people care. I do think they care, but there's only so much that can be controlled, and the government is a huge entity, and you're seeing that also now with this whole effort to streamline the process a bit and to make budget cuts and to get rid of fraud and abuse in the federal government and different agencies. And people are fighting that. And I'm like, that's not a partisan issue. We shouldn't be fighting about that. If our taxpayer dollars are being wasted, we should be in favor of somebody looking at that and exploring it and actually doing something about it. That's not partisan. That's not Democrat. That's not Republican. That's an American issue. And I have a problem when people are looking at that and fighting it. And, I could see because everybody has vested interest, in what's going on. You look at the Department of Education, what's happening right now. Well, there's a lot of people who are going to lose their livelihoods because of that. Or, that's a system that's been in place for a lot of years and it has failed our students, our kids that are going to school. Public school system is not working. Somebody needs to shake it up, and I give him credit for doing that. And you know what? On the other side, you'll get Randy Weingartner, who's the head of the Department of Education, saying this is a horrible thing. It's a terrible day in American politics and American education. And
But then
let's see.
you have the media pretty much saying, state the media is pretty much against whatever cuts are being made, and
They
people are
are. They are. That's the sad part about it is people are swayed by the media and the publicity and like this whole movement out there that's going around destroying Tesla dealerships and striking out at people that are driving Teslas. Like, what the heck are you thinking about? Like, you need to take a step back and calm down and let this work itself out. And vandalizing your next door neighbor's Tesla is not solving any problems at all, and only making more problems for you yourself when you're caught
because
and
that
apprehended.
that is a crime. What kind of crime is that? What kind of
Well, that's called criminal mischief in New Jersey, but an act of vandalism where you destroy someone else's property, vandalize their property, do destruction to their property. There's monetary levels that are attached to that, and it's called criminal mischief.
so that's a felony, or is that
It is at the lowest level. Now, in New Jersey, we grade our offenses based on degrees of offenses. We start out the lowest level, fourth
Mhm.
degree crimes, third degree crimes, second degree crimes, first degree being the worst. So it's in criminal mischief statute, it's based upon the monetary value that you would assess for each level. And then it goes up gradually. And for each level, the incarceration period and the exposure is greater.
that's really interesting? Because I think when they do something like that, you're putting other people's lives in danger. I mean, there could be a child in the car, or Someone can really
Yeah,
hurt, and these seems like they're not really.
yeah. They're firebombing these dealerships and throwing Molotov cocktails and this is just, I don't, no one should be in support of that. And any politician, quite frankly, that's speaking in favor of this, either on the Democratic side, certainly not the Republican side, but the Democratic side endorsing and promoting this type of behavior and conduct, they are not representing the people. They are violating their oath of office, quite frankly, and they should not. They should be impeached or recalled because you should not be allowed to say that. No one should ever be promoting that type of behavior.
But they did that for BLM. Remember all the riots? They did that and got away with it, and they're still in office.
Yes, they did. They did, and that is a sad statement about our system, quite frankly. And we need, as voters, to remove those people that were put in those positions. When you send someone to Washington, either as a congressperson or as a U.S. senator, they're representing your interests in your district. And you know what? If they're not speaking for you and they're just taking on their political agenda that they have, their own personal beliefs and opinions, they're not doing the job that they were really elected to do. And quite frankly, it's about the public trust. Really, is about the public trust, right? You give that person a tremendous responsibility when they go to Washington, and if they start acting on their own because
Mhm.
they have personal problems, and I look and I see so many politicians that do this, uh, in California, all over, but particularly California. I could talk about two of them in particular that do this, and it's astonishing to me. It's astonishing. I really have a hard time accepting that. Knowing what I know about government, being a student of government. I mean, I was a political science major. That's what I was in college. So I understand the three branches of government. You know, the
Mhm.
legislative, the judiciary, the executive branches. So I like to believe that I know a little bit of something about this. So
Why do you think most politicians are lawyers? It seems like a lot of politicians in office now have a law degree or have.
yeah, it's a good question. I think that's probably goes back to the old days, but if you look back to our founding fathers, I think several of them were attorneys, but many of them were just farmers, and or statespeople. I don't know, diplomats, let's say. Um, I don't know. Maybe it's because of the analytical ability to think. I think going to law school really teaches you to think on both sides. Like that's why I could become a defense attorney after being a prosecutor. Um, some people are career prosecutors and they can never think like a defense attorney, but I can see both sides. I could see the arguments being presented on both sides, and I think that's what makes a good. I don't want to say it makes a good politician, but it certainly does give you the ability to see both sides of an issue, and perhaps speak to someone on both issues and not make an enemy of somebody. And that's really a politician. You don't want to make enemies out there. You want to be able to let people know that they can rely upon you, and that you're a reasonable person, and that you're going to make prudent decisions.
Of course, there's all the backstory too. So
There is for sure.
would you ever go into politics? Would that ever be of interest to you?
I've had my foray into politics a few times. Actually, I talk about it in the book. I was up for an appointment. Now in New Jersey, we are appointed as prosecutors, the head county prosecutor, DA, by the governor. It's not an elected position. In other states, it's elected. You elect judges and you elect prosecutors. In New Jersey, it's appointed through the governor's office. The governor makes those appointments. So it is a political process, no matter how hard you want it not to be. It is a partisan issue at times in terms of that. I was up for the prosecutor's appointment in 2001 and 2012, and I did not get the appointment as the county prosecutor, primarily because of political reasons. It wasn't because I didn't have the ability or the background or the experience. I didn't think that was ever the case. I mean, I always felt that I was competent, capable to do the job, and would have done a great job. So it wasn't about that. It was really about the ties to the people to get to the governor giving you that nod. So So I have a little bit of a distaste for politics, quite frankly. I mean, I see it for what it is, and I am involved in it to some extent.
Mhm.
And I'm actually working on a campaign event for a governor's candidate for our state, who will be running for governor, who narrowly lost the last time. So I can't say that I'm removed from politics. I still, I don't want to say I dabble in it, but I'm around it. I am not involved in it though. And if I were ever asked to be, um, uh, run for an office, I'd say no. It's not for me. It's just not for me. I don't really have that particular interest to run for an office.
Right. Well, it seems like it's all about networking, who you know,
It
the people
is definitely, most
who,
definitely.
you know,
Yeah.
anything goes for lobbying, the lobbyists who have all the money to really push their own agenda. It seems like money plays a huge factor in politics, which
Most definitely. Today, more than ever. I mean, you can't run a campaign without having $1 million war chest. I mean, I don't care what position you're running for. I mean, even these local races are very, very costly. There's a huge budget that you need to have, a war chest available to you to spend that kind of money. It's really, it's sad that that happens because it really shouldn't be about the dollars because you're not getting the people that want to do the job the most. You're getting the people that have the ability to run a campaign and weather the storm. I mean, look at this last election for president. My God, $1 billion to run for president, and it was spent and gone, and 20 million still owed. So a billion, 20, I can't even do the math. It's crazy. And it was a failed campaign. And look, not a good candidate, you know.
I agree with that. Well,
I,
do you think politics will ever become about the people again? Do you think it will ever get there?
I don't know. It's really hard to say that today in this day and age with all the division and dissension between the parties and the divisions. I think it's going to take a lot. I like to be optimistic about this, but I do think that the news needs to report the news and not give opinions. That's primarily one of the fundamental problems, because they're stirring up the pot. If you just tell people, educate people, that's the job, of the news media, educate people, give them the story and give them both sides and let them make a decision. That's the way it should be. Not give an opinion like, hey, this is right and this is wrong, or this person's bad, that person's bad.
Mm.
That's not going to help. Eventually, I think it'll get back to the people because I think that there are good people that really want to do the right thing. And I mean, I've seen that. I mean, look at it, quite frankly, Trump is not being paid a salary, and people would say, oh, he doesn't need the salary. Well, doesn't matter. He's not taking a salary and he's donating the money, just like many of the people in his cabinet are not taking salaries. And that tells me something. you
Right.
know if you're not going to take a salary and you're going to do that job just for the betterment of the country and the people, that tells me something about you as a person.
That says a lot. Yeah, it really does. Well, do you think in the courtroom, do you think it is about the person, that the courtroom itself is about people, or is it about agendas?
It depends. It does depend. I really do think that it depends upon the type of case or the person, the crime. um, all of those things come into play, quite frankly. I did view it as, being part of a prosecutor's office. I understand the promotion of moving a case through, you know, especially if it has media attention, exposure, to make sure that the case is prosecuted to the full extent, and that the person is punished to the full extent if they're convicted or they plead guilty. To ask the court for maximum sentences. I get all that. I understand that, but that could be the viewpoint of the administration of the office pushing the people underneath. The
Mhm.
same way the court system might have a certain viewpoint if, and I talk about it a little bit in the book. Really, it's about making a determination whether someone should be incarcerated,
Mhm.
waiting for their day in court after an arrest. In New Jersey, we've changed our standard. Like most states, we have a Criminal Justice Reform Act, which really eliminated cash bails. And I thought in my mind, that sounded like a great idea, eliminating cash bails. but I don't think it served the purpose that it's designed to. And it really, what it did ultimately, and in New Jersey, we have something, and if judges listen to this, they're not going to be happy to hear this, but we have a public safety assessment. It's called a PSA. They give a score, a mathematical calculation. It's run through an algorithm. It's presented to the judge by a probation officer. And the judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney all have that score, a mathematical calculation, which talks basically about this person, this individual, the type of crime, whether they should be incarcerated, really basing it on the degree of the offense and the likelihood of the incarceration if they're convicted. It doesn't talk about the evidence or the proofs. It really doesn't say anything about the necessary evidence to convict that individual. But judges are looking at these numerical scores and they're saying somebody is going to stay in based on that numerical score, or they're going to release them based on that. And I think it's taken a lot away from judges. He or she doesn't have the ability to look at the individual. And back in the old days when I was a young prosecutor, the simple equation was, are they a risk of flight and a danger to the community? That's it.
Right.
Risk of flight, danger to the community. And if they're a risk of flight, you would say, hey, they got ties to another community, they don't have any family here. And a danger to the community could be they have a prior criminal history and they've been convicted on numerous occasions and they've done time. They know the criminal justice system, and this is a really serious crime. You know, that to me actually was pretty effective. And then the judge listens to the arguments being made on both sides and says, you know what, I'm going to let this person out with a cash bail to ensure
Mhm.
that they come to court.
Right.
Or, you know what, that person should stay incarcerated until they have their day in court. Um, this
Well,
PSA system changed that dramatically. I felt it took the judging out of judging, quite frankly, just on that one level, on that one issue.
well, it seems like this kind of lending itself to go more AI directed. Do you think more artificial intelligence will be involved in the legal system?
You know what? There's a big movement out there now, and I have to confess I'm not really educated on that issue. And there is a big push to get AI into the legal system and for attorneys to start using it to their benefit. And I'm not so sure about it. I really don't know. I don't know that a computer generated answer to something is really the answer, quite frankly. And gone are the days of doing the research and the homework necessary. And books are going by the wayside. Of course, nobody has law books anymore. Everything is done on the computer pretty much, and AI is a big part of that. And they're actually teaching courses about it. So yeah, I think there is a bit of a movement towards that. And then I get back to where I started, and look, we've got to be able to look people in the eyes and talk to them as a juror, and as the defense attorney or prosecutor. You have to have that ability to connect with people, and certainly AI is not going to promote that.
Right. Well, if there's one thing you would want to change in the legal system, what would that be?
Wow, that's a loaded question. What I see so much of, and it maybe it's not just in the judging aspect, but I would like to see judges remove themselves from cases where they have an interest. If they have a bias or an interest, they have an obligation and a duty to recuse themselves or remove themselves from the case. And I don't see that happening. If you have a vested interest or a family member that's tied into um, an argument that could be made on the other side of the equation, you shouldn't be handling that case. It really, and it's so practical. It's such an easy issue that should be decided. And I really scratch my head when I see judges stay in cases that they have no business staying in. When you start, you know, connecting the dots, and you can see that there's an interest, there's a bias. Um, the job of any judge is to be fair, impartial, unbiased, neutral, and detached. That's it. And if you can't do that job and that function in those circumstances under those definitional requirements, which are fundamental, then you shouldn't be presiding over that case. And it's very hard to do, quite frankly, because we all have our own mindset. I have mine, you have yours, and certainly anybody listening has their own opinions about things, whether they're justified or not, whether they're knowledgeable opinions, that are supported. or not. But we all have our preconceived notions, and it's hard to take yourself away from those. But you do have to do that when you're in the court system. That has to happen.
And it doesn't.
And it
So,
doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't. And a lot of what happens sometimes when people are charged with serious crimes is the court looks at it as, well, let's keep this person in jail, because if I let that person out and God forbid something were to happen, my exposure's on the line. Then that's my reputation, my background, my experience. I'll be in the news. And, you should never do your job because you're afraid to do it.
I
I mean,
agree.
that's really not, that shouldn't factor into the decision making. I think I talk about that in one case where a judge actually went above and beyond and released a client that I had that was charged with an armed robbery. I said it wasn't him. He didn't do it. And the evidence that was presented at that preliminary hearing was a photograph, and I said, this is not even him. I held it next to, I think he was on closed circuit TV. I held it next to the camera, and I said to his image, look at these two people. They're not even the same. How can the prosecutor be standing here making the argument that it's my client? And the judge took a chance and said, you know what? He's released. And ultimately, he was vindicated. He didn't participate in this armed robbery. And
Mm.
matter of fact, I just got a text message from him the other day, and that was several years ago, and we still keep in touch.
Oh, good. Well, do you believe the scales will ever be balanced based on everything that's happening now?
I'm optimistic. I like to believe yes, but I hear so many examples that it's not. I just read a book by John Grisham and uh, Jim Calhoun. It's a book called Framed, where he talked about 10, not just John Grisham, but Jim Calhoun did 5. And John Grisham did 5 particular cases where people were wrongfully arrested, convicted, tried, and sentenced. And ultimately, they did not commit the crimes. And it was really based largely upon prosecutorial misconduct, the prosecutor not turning over evidence that was what we would call exculpatory, where it clearly showed this individual did not commit the crime or the offense, and they did not reveal it. They were hiding evidence from the defense. They knew they were using jailhouse informants and things like that that were deemed to be unreliable witnesses, and they were lying for a better deal, and they weren't disclosing that to the defense attorney or judges that were allowing this type of conduct or behavior to go on when they knew it was happening. So I look at that book and I say, my goodness, that those cases are not that old, and that still happens.
Mm.
And sadly, one individual was put to death in Texas. He was accused and convicted and sentenced for killing his 3 children and burning the house down. And it was determined that the arson investigation was done haphazardly, slipshod, and the arson investigator had no real experience. He had a 48-hour training course, really didn't know anything, and his opinion was always that it was an arson committed, always, whether it was an accidental fire or not. And when they dug deep and they went to a real arson expert, they said, no, this fire was not set intentionally.
Wow.
So anyway, but that's a really sad case. But and then I just listened to a Joe Rogan podcast recently. He had on uh, an attorney, I believe his name is Josh Dubin, who's involved with it's something similar to Project Innocence, where
Mm.
he has a team. He runs it through Perlmutter, is the financial backer. And he has been responsible for having many, many people whose convictions were wrongful convictions uh, overturned and had them released. And he went on to talk about a case with a prosecutor. The prosecutor was on the podcast with him. And the prosecutor was actually accused of committing crimes because he agreed to undo a conviction where he saw that it was wrongful and the evidence didn't support it. So the locals went after him, and
Oh,
it was really an interesting podcast.
they,
So
so,
I like to be optimistic, but when I see things like that happen, I really and even today with what's happening with the court system, I have my own opinions
mm.
that Judges are overstepping. They should not be involved in handling of cases and determining policy from the bench. That's
Mhm.
not that's not the role of the judiciary. Um, so I don't know. I don't know. I like to be optimistic. I like to believe, but I also believe it depends upon the people that are involved. Quite frankly, it's all about the people and the process, how the process is handled. And I can't say that every case is done the way it should be done, and that might just be my view. There's no such thing as a perfect case being handled in the court system.
True. All right. So for young people going to law school or wanting to go into law school, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, my advice is really pretty easy. Just follow your passion. And it might not be a litigator. You might not want to ever set foot in a courtroom and have to, be a criminal defense attorney or a prosecutor, or a commercial litigator or a personal injury lawyer. So you might want to do estate planning, or you might want to do real estate closings, but there's really a hat for everyone. It's not a one size fits all. So I say follow your passion. I did have a bit of a foray into. I wanted to be a sports agent at one time. I think it was post Jerry Maguire, and I saw the movie. I was like, wow, that's really fascinating. I had just left the prosecutor's office around that time, and I was thinking I really could relate to being a sports agent, negotiating contracts, and I love sports, and I love football, and I played football, and I could see myself, relating to these guys, and um, but it didn't work out. I took the NFL player agent exam and I missed by 2 questions. And then I found out it was big business. You really have got to be entrenched in this. Like anything else, you need to know who you know. And it's really about the connections and the people along the way. You're not just going to be a new sports agent and have these players come to you. You had to like get yourself involved in that process to get to know people. And you had to work very hard to get there. It's like anything else. You have to put the time in.
Exactly. You have to get to know the people.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So my advice to any law student that I give to them, quite frankly, when I'm teaching, is follow your passion. You don't really need to go into a courtroom, but you'll know when you put your head down at the end of the night on your pillow that you're happy or not doing what you're doing. And if you're not, then there's other things to do. And don't feel like because you invested in a law school of 3 years and you took a bar exam that you're committed to that. You can always change directions. And that's kind of what I did, quite frankly. I mean, I closed my practice in 2023. I became of counsel with the firm where I have a role with the firm, but it's not like I'm there every day and I have to be there every day. And I get to do these things, what I'm doing now. I get to write a book and I get to promote the book and market the book and talk and
Mhm.
and teach. So there is life after. So I try to tell people that don't feel like you can't change directions. You always have to be able to pivot and move in a different direction. If that's where your head and your heart are, you should go that way.
So going back to the film industry, which is changing so much, would you ever be interested in being a consultant for either a crime drama or a movie that has to deal with courtroom dramas or particular cases? Just to
Yeah,
be
I could see doing that. Yeah, I think that would be. I think it would be enjoyable. It would be fun. I don't think that's kind of like not my idea of a job. you know. Yeah, I think I could do that easily. Quite frankly, I would have no issue with doing that if I were approached on that level. And I have, I've done TV. I've been a legal analyst for probably 18 years, talking about really high profile cases like OJ, like the Menendez brothers, like Harvey Weinstein, Michael Jackson. Over the years, I've talked about so many cases. And the Phil Spector case was another one that I was involved in.
right.
Well, and so I did a lot
I
of
would,
commentary on those cases over the years, and they were all cases. Scott Peterson. I mean, and I kid now, and I say what's old is new now, because if you turn Netflix on, you got OJ, you got Scott Peterson, you got the Menendez brothers. They're all back. That seemed like a lifetime ago for me talking about those cases, on
yeah.
court TV or CNN or whatever the medium was at the time.
And does law ever really change? Seems like we're still in the witch hunt season. It's like you are guilty until proven innocent if they want you to be innocent. it seems like there's this whole corruption thing going on. And it'd be so nice just to see that whole corruption obliterated. And I like,
Yeah, I think it's inherent in our system. I mean, we have developed our system of law based on English common law. That's where our principles of law come from. Our system's not that dissimilar to England. They call attorneys, I believe, barristers there, or
Mhm.
solicitors. We call esquire. We say esquire. We base a lot of our codified law on the roots based on common law in England. And so it's interesting when you say about the Salem witch trials. I mean, are we that far removed? They put those women to death, and God knows what kind of evidence they had and how it was presented. But I'd like to believe it in this day and age that we're a lot more sophisticated and certainly technologically savvy. And that was also another thing. I mean, quite frankly, I mean, jurors watch so much television, and I think that they want to be entertained. They so you got to kind of explain to them, this is not a high crime drama. We're not going to be like having forensic evidence here, and pathology reports here and there, and or you're going to see some movie. A lot of cases don't have that. They don't have that kind of evidence. I think jurors can tend to be disappointed because they watch so much courtroom drama on TV that they expect the experience in the courtroom to be the same way.
And that's not necessarily the case.
It's not. It's not.
But we do need people to serve as jurors, to want to be jurors, to really be
Oh,
important.
most definitely. I just watched the movie. I think Clint Eastwood was the
Oh,
producer.
juror number two.
Juror number two, which was an interesting case, especially because I used to prosecute vehicular homicides, and
Right.
I was involved in a lot of situations involving vehicular homicides, and I found it a bit fascinating that the whole concept that he was, selected as a juror and sat as a juror through the trial. Yeah, I think you do absolutely, and it's part of our civic duty. Quite frankly, it's an important duty to serve as a juror. I was almost selected as a juror, and I was surprised. Actually, it was a very
Mhm.
very intense case. It involved an Asian crime invasion into a family and to rob them. Uh, there was a lot of cash in the house, and the family was housing these people that were working at a restaurant, Chinese restaurant, and it
Mhm.
was all cash business. So these perpetrators were Asian, and they invaded the home to try to find the money, of course. And I was brought into the jury selection process, and I was selected. Um, and I was sitting in the jury panel, and I knew a couple of the defense attorneys. I knew the prosecutor. I actually didn't have a great experience with the case that I had dealt with, and I was surprised that he wouldn't have, excuse me. I said, I'm a solo practitioner. I have my own practice, and they knew all that. Well, by the end of the day, I was still in the jury box, and I said to the judge, "Can I approach with counsel?" The prosecution and the defense. There were three defendants on trial, three accused, and the three defense attorneys and myself and the prosecutor went up, and we approached the judge, and I said, "Judge, this case is going to take 3 weeks. There's no way I could sit for 3 weeks and hear this case." I said, "I'm surprised that both sides are keeping me on. I'm a defense attorney, former prosecutor." I said, I could go either way here. But she says, "Well, that's the reason you're here." And I said, "But Judge, I can't do it, honestly." I said, I'm so sorry. I would love to do this, but it would literally bankrupt my practice. And for 3 weeks, me not being there, or not being able to, manage the finances, and bringing in cases and meeting with new clients. And I could never do this. My head would never be in this case. And I was excused. So it is an important function, though. My point is that being a juror is a fundamental, it's tantamount to our system working the right way.
Right. Yeah. Well, we need to find as much balance as we can in a very unbalanced world.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. And that's, I think, where you hope that a jury comes in, is that you get people with level heads from the community
Right.
that are, but I feel like you almost need some level of sophistication, almost. You need to have a little bit of background and knowledge. And sometimes when you're just thrown into the box there, and, you're like, wow, this is a crazy experience.
Right. Well, I have purchased your book. I read
Well,
it,
thank you.
like it. People can find it on Amazon and other online booksellers. Is this in bookstores right now?
It's
Like,
not. It's not. I'm working to get it in there. I'm working with a publishing company. I work with a hybrid publishing company called Ex Libris, and it is on Barnes and Noble also. But I am trying to get it into some,
right.
brick and mortar bookstores, which is, quite frankly, they're getting harder and harder to find.
But the younger generation, this Gen Z, they seem to love bookstores, which is great. I mean,
Yeah, I see a lot. Barnes and Noble has captured that audience with the coffee bars and things like
right,
that. It's a to
right,
see, it's refreshing to see that people actually physically pick up a book and hold it in their hand. And because I'm actually doing an Audible on it right now, doing an Audible book. Yeah.
mm.
So that's going to be the next format, to do it in Audible format.
Well, I'll definitely leave a link down below. And if someone wants to reach out to you for whatever reason, can they?
Yes, easily my name. You just Google my name, James M Porfido, Porfido, and you can find a website, perfidolaw.com, which will take you to my firm website. And I
Awesome.
also have a website under the name of the book, www.unequal-justice.com. It talks about the book and a little bit about me. And of course, I'm on social media all over the place. So, yes, easy to find.
Well, thank you. You have a wonderful day. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure. Thank you, Cynthia.